The first torpedo struck the Takasago Maru at 11:47 p.m. on March 15, 1944, tearing through the hull just below the red cross painted on her white-painted side. Dr. Kenji Yamamoto felt the ship lurch beneath his feet as he bent over a wounded soldier's stretcher in the converted cargo hold that served as the main ward. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely.
But even as he gave the order, Mitchell knew that help would come too late for most of those people in the water. The South China Sea was vast, the night was cold, and the nearest Allied vessel was hundreds of miles away. The assignment came to Dr. Kenji Yamamoto on a crisp September morning in 1943, delivered by a young lieutenant who seemed barely old enough to shave. Kenji had been expecting something like this. Senior medical officers with his qualifications weren't left in comfortable Tokyo hospitals when the war effort demanded their expertise elsewhere. "You are to report to Kure Naval Base immediately," the lieutenant announced, standing rigidly at attention in Kenji's small office at Tokyo Army Hospital. "You've been assigned to the hospital ship program." Kenji set down his cup of weak tea and studied the orders. The document bore the seal of the Imperial Navy Medical Corps and was signed by Admiral Yamamoto himself, no relation despite sharing the same surname. The assignment was both an honor and a burden he had hoped to avoid. "Hospital ships," he repeated carefully. "I assume this relates to the new neutral vessel program." The lieutenant's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, uncertainty perhaps, or concern. "Yes, sir. The Takasago Maru and her sister ships are being converted from passenger vessels to hospital ships in accordance with international law. You will serve as chief medical officer." After the lieutenant left, Kenji sat alone in his office, studying the implications of his new assignment. The hospital ship program was Japan's answer to increasing pressure from the International Red Cross and neutral nations. As the war turned increasingly against Japan, international opinion had become crucial. Hospital ships would demonstrate Japan's commitment to the Geneva Convention while providing desperately needed medical care for wounded soldiers returning from the Pacific Theater. It was also, Kenji suspected, more complicated than it appeared. That evening, he had dinner with his wife, Sachiko, in their small apartment near the hospital. She had prepared his favorite meal, grilled fish with rice and pickled vegetables, though he could see the worry in her eyes despite her cheerful demeanor. "The hospital ship assignment is a good one," she said, refilling his teacup. "You'll be saving lives instead of just treating casualties after the battles are over." "Hospital ships are supposed to be neutral," Kenji replied, picking at his food. "They're supposed to be non-targets, but these days I wonder if anyone still respects such distinctions." Sachiko reached across the small table and took his hand, drawing strength from her presence. At 34, he had already seen more of war's brutality than most people witnessed in several lifetimes. The field hospitals in China, the emergency surgeries performed under artillery fire, and the young soldiers who died calling for their mothers, it had all left its mark. Perhaps serving on a hospital ship would provide some refuge from the worst of it. He had no way of knowing that his new assignment would place him directly in the path of a moral catastrophe that would challenge everything he believed about honor, duty, and the nature of warfare itself. The Takasago Maru had been a passenger liner before the war, carrying well-to-do travelers between Tokyo and the ports of Southeast Asia. Now, as Kenji walked through her converted interior, she bore little resemblance to her former elegance. The grand ballroom had been transformed into a surgery suite, complete with operating tables and modern medical equipment acquired through neutral countries. The luxury staterooms had been converted into hospital wards, their walls painted white and fitted with rows of military cots. "She's a beautiful ship," said Chief Nurse Akiko Tanaka, joining Tenji on the promenade deck. At 28, she was one of the most experienced naval nurses in the service, having volunteered for the dangerous assignment despite having other options. "The crew has worked night and day to complete the conversion on schedule." I nodded, impressed despite my reservations. The ship's white hull gleamed in the morning sun, marked with prominent red crosses on both sides and illuminated by special lighting systems that would make her visible from miles away, even at night. Every detail had been carefully planned to comply with the Geneva Convention's requirements for hospital ships. "Have you reviewed the patient manifest for our first voyage?" Akiko consulted her clipboard. 230 wounded from the Solomon Islands campaign, ranging from minor injuries to severe trauma cases. We also have 42 American POWs who require medical treatment, 3 with serious injuries from the fighting on Guadalcanal. This gave Kenji pause. Including enemy wounded on hospital ships was required by international law, but it created complicated practical and political problems. How are the crew members feeling about treating American patients?
"Most are professional about it," Akiko replied carefully. "They understand that medical ethics transcend nationality, but there's some tension. These men have lost friends and family to American bombs and bullets." Kenji understood the difficulty. War created intense emotional bonds between comrades and equally intense hatred toward enemies. Asking medical personnel to set aside those feelings and treat all patients equally was perhaps the greatest challenge of serving on a hospital ship. "We'll need to address this directly," he decided. "I'll speak to the entire medical staff before we depart. Everyone must understand that on this ship there are no enemies, only patients who need our help." As they toured the medical facilities, Kenji was impressed by the thoroughness of the conversion. The ship had been equipped with the most modern surgical equipment available, including new X-ray machines and blood transfusion apparatus. The pharmacy was well stocked with medicines that had become increasingly scarce in Japan. The laboratory could perform complex tests, and the dental facility could handle everything from routine cleanings to complex oral surgery. "The Imperial Navy has spared no expense," he observed. Akiko's expression grew thoughtful. "Perhaps that's what concerns me. This level of investment suggests they expect hospital ships to play a major role in the war effort." "What do you mean?" "Think about it, Doctor. We are not just treating wounded soldiers. We're demonstrating to the world that Japan honors international law and cares for prisoners of war. This ship is as much about propaganda and diplomacy as it is about medicine." Kenji considered this as they continued their inspection. The hospital ship program had indeed received unusual attention from high-ranking officials. Admiral Yamamoto had personally inspected the conversion work, and representatives from the International Red Cross had been given complete access to verify compliance with Geneva Convention requirements. The ship's departure would be covered by newsreel cameras and international correspondence. That afternoon, he met with Captain Hiroshi Sato, the ship's commanding officer. Sato was a career naval officer who had commanded destroyers earlier in the war before being assigned to the hospital ship program. He seemed competent but somewhat uncomfortable with his new role. "I must be honest with you, Doctor," Sato said as they stood in his quarters. "I'm not entirely comfortable with some aspects of this assignment. Hospital ships operate under different rules than warships, and those rules can create complications." "What sort of complications?" Sato moved to the porthole and looked out at the harbor, where Japanese warships were preparing for their next missions. "Hospital ships must announce their positions and follow predetermined routes. They cannot take evasive action or defend themselves. They rely entirely on enemy recognition and respect for international law." "That's the point. Hospital ships are neutral. They're not a threat to anyone." "But what if the enemy doesn't see it that way?" Sato turned back to face him. "What if they decide that any Japanese ship is a legitimate target, regardless of its markings or mission?" The question hung in the air between them, unspoken fears given voice. Both men had heard rumors about American submarines becoming increasingly aggressive in their attacks on Japanese shipping. Some reports suggested that U.S. forces had begun attacking vessels that might once have been considered off-limits. "We must trust in international law and human decency," Kenji said finally. "The alternative is to abandon the principles that separate civilized nations from barbarians." Sato nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "I hope you're right, Doctor. For all our sakes, I hope you're right." The Takasago Maru departed Tokyo Bay on October 12, 1943, under clear skies and with great fanfare. Newsreel cameras captured her departure as military bands played and dignitaries waved from the dock. International observers, including representatives from the Swiss Red Cross, were aboard to document the ship's compliance with Geneva Convention requirements. The ship's departure would be covered by newsreel cameras and international correspondence. That afternoon, he met with Captain Hiroshi Sato, the ship's commanding officer. Sato was a career naval officer who had commanded destroyers earlier in the war before being assigned to the hospital ship program. He seemed competent, but somewhat uncomfortable with his new role. "I must be honest with you, Doctor," Sato said, as they stood in his quarters. "I'm not entirely comfortable with some aspects of this assignment. Hospital ships operate under different rules than warships, and those rules can create complications." "What sort of complications?" Sato moved to the porthole and looked out at the harbor, where Japanese warships were preparing for their next missions. "Hospital ships must announce their positions and follow predetermined routes. They cannot take evasive action or defend themselves. They rely entirely on enemy recognition and respect for international law." "That's the point. Hospital ships are neutral. They're not a threat to anyone." "But what if the enemy doesn't see it that way?" Sato turned back to face him. "What if they decide that any Japanese ship is a legitimate target, regardless of its markings or mission?" The question hung in the air between them, unspoken fears given voice. Both men had heard rumors about American submarines becoming increasingly aggressive in their attacks on Japanese shipping. Some reports suggested that U.S. forces had begun attacking vessels that might once have been considered off-limits. "We must trust in international law and human decency," Kenji said finally. "The alternative is to abandon the principles that separate civilized nations from barbarians." Sato nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "I hope you're right, Doctor. For all our sakes, I hope you're right." The Takasago Maru departed Tokyo Bay on October 12, 1943, under clear skies and with great fanfare. Newsreel cameras captured her departure as military bands played and dignitaries waved from the dock. International observers, including representatives from the Swiss Red Cross, were aboard to document the ship's compliance with Geneva Convention requirements. The ship's departure would be covered by newsreel cameras and international correspondence. Kenji stood on the bridge with Captain Sato as they navigated through the harbor entrance, watching the Japanese home islands fade into the distance. The ship's powerful engines pushed them steadily southward toward the Solomon Islands, where they would collect their first load of wounded soldiers. "It feels strange," Sato observed, "sailing without escort vessels or any defensive armament. I've never commanded a ship that couldn't defend itself." "We have the best protection possible," Kenji replied, pointing to the large red crosses painted on the ship's superstructure. "International law and human decency." The first 2 days of the voyage passed without incident. The medical staff used the time to organize their facilities and prepare for the wounded they would soon be treating. Kenji conducted daily meetings with his department heads, ensuring that everyone understood the protocols for treating patients from multiple nationalities. "Remember, we are not Japanese doctors treating Japanese soldiers. We are medical professionals treating human beings who happen to be injured. The Hippocratic Oath makes no distinction between friend and enemy." Nurse Tanaka raised her hand. "What about intelligence information we might overhear from American prisoners? Are we obligated to report it? The question created an uncomfortable silence. It touched on one of the fundamental contradictions of the hospital ship program: how to remain truly neutral while serving one side in an active war. We are medical personnel, not intelligence officers. Our duty is to heal, not to gather information for military purposes. Anyone who violates medical confidentiality will be removed from the program immediately. On the third day, they encountered their first test. A Japanese destroyer approached at high speed, signaling for identification. Sato responded with the proper codes and displayed the ship's medical credentials, but the destroyer's captain seemed suspicious of their neutral status. "They want to come on board for inspection," Sato reported to Kenji after the radio exchange. "It's their right under the Naval Code, but it could create problems if they discover the American POWs we'll be carrying." "We have nothing to hide," Kenji insisted. "This ship operates in full compliance with international law." The inspection went smoothly, with the destroyer's officers impressed by the medical facilities and professional conduct of the crew. But Kenji noticed the inspectors paying particular attention to the ship's communication equipment and navigation systems. They asked detailed questions about routes, schedules, and security protocols that seemed to go beyond routine inspection. After the destroyer departed, Nurse Tanaka approached Kenji with concerns from her staff. "Some of the nurses are worried," she said quietly. "They think the ship is being watched too closely by our own forces. There are rumors that hospital ships might be used for purposes beyond."
What sort of purposes? Intelligence gathering, transport of special personnel or equipment. Some even whisper about carrying communications gear for coordinating submarine attacks. Kenji felt a chill run down his spine. If such rumors were circulating among the medical staff, they were certainly being discussed in military circles as well. And if Japanese forces were using hospital ships for non-medical purposes, it would provide justification for enemy attacks on all vessels bearing red crosses. "Have you seen any evidence of such activities on this ship?" he asked. "No," Tanaka replied quickly. "But that doesn't mean they aren't happening. There are areas of the ship that medical personnel aren't allowed to access." That evening, Kenji requested a private meeting with Captain Sato. He found the captain in his quarters, studying charts and weather reports. "Captain, I need your assurance that this ship is being used only for medical purposes," Kenji said directly. "There are rumors among the crew about other activities." Sato set down his charts and studied Kenji's face carefully. "Doctor, I will tell you what I can. This ship's primary mission is medical care for wounded personnel. Everything we do is in compliance with international law regarding hospital ships." "That's not exactly a denial of other activities." "It's the only answer I can give you." Sato's tone made it clear that the conversation was over. "I suggest you focus on preparing your medical facilities. We'll reach the Solomon Islands tomorrow, and there will be plenty of work to keep you busy." That night, Kenji lay awake in his narrow bunk, listening to the ship's engines and wondering what he had gotten himself into. The hospital ship program was supposed to be a humanitarian mission, a chance to save lives while maintaining Japan's reputation as a civilized nation. But the undercurrents of suspicion and secrecy suggested something more complex and potentially dangerous. He thought about his wife, Sachiko, safe in their Tokyo apartment, and wondered if he would see her again. Hospital ships were supposed to be safe, but in a war where the rules seemed to change daily, safety was becoming an increasingly relative concept. The harbor at Rabaul was a scene of barely controlled chaos when the Takasago Maru arrived. Japanese ships of various sizes crowded the anchorage, many bearing visible damage from recent encounters with Allied forces. Columns of smoke rose from several vessels under repair, and the air carried the acrid smell of burning oil and metal. Kenji stood on the hospital ship's deck, watching as the first wounded were brought alongside in motor launches. The sight was both familiar and heartbreaking. Young men with bandaged limbs and haunted eyes, stretcher cases covered in blood-stained blankets, walking wounded supporting each other as they climbed the accommodation ladder. "Prepare to receive casualties," he announced over the ship's public address system. "All medical personnel to stations. This is not a drill."
The first patient brought aboard was a 20-year-old private named Yoshida, suffering from severe burns received when his transport ship was attacked by Allied aircraft. His injuries were extensive but treatable, and Kenji immediately directed him to the main surgery suite. "How many more like this?" he asked the medical orderly accompanying the patient. 43 burn cases," the orderly replied grimly, "plus 67 wounded from ground fighting, 31 with tropical diseases, and the American prisoners." As the wounded continued to arrive, Kenji moved through the ship's medical facilities, assessing the most serious cases and directing treatment priorities. The burn victims required immediate attention to prevent infection and shock. The battle wounds needed surgical intervention to remove shrapnel and repair damaged organs. The disease cases required isolation and specialized treatment for malaria, dysentery, and other tropical ailments. In the middle of organizing this medical emergency, he encountered his first moral dilemma. A Japanese sergeant with a severe abdominal wound arrived at the same time as an American POW suffering from an infected leg wound. Both needed immediate surgery, but Kenji had only one operating table available. The Japanese sergeant was more seriously injured and would die without immediate intervention. The American's condition was serious, but not immediately life-threatening. Medical ethics demanded treating the most serious case first, regardless of nationality. But the Japanese medical orderlies were clearly expecting their countrymen to receive priority treatment. "Take the American to surgery first," Kenji ordered, making his decision purely on medical necessity. "Sir?" The lead orderly looked confused. "The sergeant is one of our own soldiers." "The sergeant's injuries can wait another 30 minutes. The American's infection could become septic if we delay treatment further." Kenji's voice carried the authority of medical expertise and moral conviction. "On this ship, we treat patients based on medical need, not nationality." The surgery on the American POW took 40 minutes. The patient was a Marine sergeant named William Patterson, captured during the fighting on Guadalcanal. His leg wound had become infected during weeks in a Japanese prison camp, and gangrene was beginning to set in. Kenji was able to clean the wound and remove the infected tissue, saving the leg and probably the man's life. When he emerged from surgery, he found Nurse Tanaka waiting with an update on the Japanese sergeant. "His condition has stabilized," she reported. "The delay didn't worsen his prognosis significantly. He should make a full recovery." "Good. Have you had any problems with the crew regarding our treatment priorities?" Tanaka hesitated. "Some grumbling, but nothing serious. Most of the medical staff understand the ethical requirements. It's some of the ship's crew who seem uncomfortable with treating enemy wounded." That evening, as the Takasago Maru prepared to depart Rabaul with her full load of patients, Kenji conducted rounds through the ship's medical wards. The sight was both encouraging and sobering. Japanese and American wounded lying side by side, receiving identical care from the same medical staff. In Ward B, he stopped to check on Sergeant Patterson, whose leg wound was responding well to treatment. The American was conscious and alert, though clearly wary of his surroundings. "How are you feeling, Sergeant?" Kenji asked, in careful English. "You speak English pretty well for a Jap doctor." "I studied at Johns Hopkins University before the war," Kenji replied, choosing to ignore the racial slur. "Your wound is healing nicely.
You should make a complete recovery." "Why are you helping me?" Patterson's question carried genuine confusion. "I was shooting at your people a month ago."
Kenji sat down on the chair beside the bed, considering how to answer. "Because you're a human being who needs medical care, and because that's what doctors do, regardless of politics or nationality." Patterson stared at him for a long moment. "I heard about this hospital ship program. Most of us figured it was just propaganda, something to impress the Red Cross. What do you think now?" I think maybe there are still some decent people left in this war." Similar conversations took place throughout the ship as medical personnel and patients struggled to reconcile their humanity with the brutal realities of warfare. Japanese soldiers found themselves impressed by the professional competence and dedication of medical staff who treated all patients equally. American prisoners discovered that their captors were capable of genuine compassion and medical skill. But beneath the surface, tensions remained. Some Japanese patients resented sharing medical facilities with enemy wounded. Some crew members questioned whether they were being too generous with resources needed for their own countrymen. And everyone wondered what would happen if Allied forces discovered American prisoners aboard a Japanese hospital ship. On the third day of the return voyage to Japan, those questions took on new urgency when a lookout spotted submarine periscopes tracking the ship's movement. Captain Sato immediately signaled the ship's identity and medical mission, but the submarine maintained its distance, neither attacking nor departing. "They're watching us," Sato reported to Kenji during an evening briefing. "Intelligence suggests Allied submarines are tracking all Japanese shipping movements, including hospital ships." "Are we in danger?" "According to international law, no. Hospital ships are protected from attack, but intelligence also suggests that some Allied commanders are becoming less concerned with legal niceties." That night, Kenji lay in his bunk, listening to the sound of the ship's engines and wondering if those engines might be the last sound he ever heard. Hospital ships were supposed to be safe, but safety was a relative concept in a war that seemed to escalate daily toward new levels of brutality and moral compromise. Outside his porthole, he could see the lights that marked the ship as a protected medical vessel, lights that should guarantee safe passage, but might also serve as a beacon for enemy submarines looking for targets of opportunity. The war was changing, and Kenji feared that the changes would ultimately destroy the humanitarian principles that made civilization possible. Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell received his orders on a gray November morning at Pearl Harbor, delivered in a sealed envelope marked with the highest security classifications. The briefing room was windowless and sterile, occupied only by Mitchell and a naval intelligence officer whose name he never learned. "The Japanese hospital ship program is not what it appears to be," the intelligence officer began without preamble, spreading photographs and documents across the table. "These vessels are being used to transport troops, supplies, and intelligence personnel under the protection of Red Cross markings." Mitchell studied the photographs, which showed ships with prominent medical markings alongside what appeared to be military personnel and equipment. The images were grainy and difficult to interpret, but they seemed to support the intelligence officer's claims. "Are we certain about this? Attacking hospital ships would be a clear violation of international law. International law is a luxury we can no longer afford. The Japanese are using our respect for humanitarian principles against us. These ships are carrying troops and supplies to reinforce their Pacific positions while remaining immune from attack." The briefing continued for 2 hours, with detailed presentations on suspected Japanese violations of Geneva Convention protocols. According to intelligence reports, hospital ships were carrying far more personnel than necessary for medical missions. They were following routes that coincided with military supply runs, and intercepted communications suggested coordination with combat operations.
"Your orders are explicit," the intelligence officer concluded. "Any Japanese vessel suspected of military activity is to be considered a legitimate target, regardless of medical markings. The safety of American forces takes precedence over legal technicalities." Mitchell left the briefing with a heavy heart and a folder full of classified documents. At 31, he had commanded submarines for 5 years and had never questioned the legitimacy of his targets. Japanese warships, transports, and supply vessels were all clearly military objectives, but the idea of attacking vessels marked with red crosses challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare and morality. That afternoon, he met with his executive officer, Lieutenant Thompson, in the wardroom of the USS Barracuda. Thompson was younger than Mitchell, but equally experienced in submarine warfare, having served in the Atlantic before transferring to the Pacific theater. "What do you make of these intelligence reports?" Mitchell asked, sharing some of the less sensitive documents from the briefing. Thompson studied the photographs and reports carefully. "If these are accurate, then the Japanese are clearly violating the Geneva Convention. But some of these images are pretty ambiguous. It's hard to tell military personnel from medical staff at this resolution. That's my concern. What if intelligence is wrong? What if we sink a legitimate hospital ship full of wounded soldiers and medical personnel?" "Then we'll have committed a war crime," Thompson replied bluntly. "But if we don't act, and these ships are carrying troops and supplies that kill American soldiers, we'll have failed in our duty to protect our own forces." The moral dilemma was clear, but unsolvable. In a war where deception and misdirection were standard tactics, how could anyone be certain about the true nature of any vessel? Hospital ships provided perfect cover for military operations precisely because they were supposed to be immune from attack. Over the following weeks, as the Barracuda conducted patrols in the South China Sea, Mitchell wrestled with the implications of his orders. He studied every intelligence report, analyzed every photograph, and consulted with his officers about the legal and moral dimensions of their mission. The submarine's crew, unaware of the specific nature of their new orders, continued their normal routine of hunting Japanese shipping. They tracked troop transports, supply vessels, and warships with professional efficiency, sinking several targets and earning commendations for their success. But Mitchell knew that their next target might be fundamentally different from anything they had attacked before. Dr. Kenji Yamamoto began to notice the patterns during the Takasago Maru's third voyage in December 1943. The ship was carrying wounded from the Marshall Islands campaign, including several cases of severe trauma that required immediate surgical intervention. But alongside the legitimate patients were personnel who didn't quite fit the medical profile. "Doctor, we have 23 new patients boarding," Nurse Tanaka reported as they approached the pickup point, "but 15 of them don't appear to be wounded." Kenji reviewed the manifest, noting discrepancies between the reported injuries and the apparent condition of several patients. Some were listed as suffering from battle fatigue or minor wounds, but they appeared to be healthy combat troops in medical gowns. "Have you questioned the medical officer who provided these manifests?" he asked. "I tried. He says the patients are recovering from various ailments and need continued medical supervision, but they're occupying beds that could be used for seriously wounded soldiers." The situation became more complicated when Captain Sato informed Kenji that several of the patients would need access to the ship's communication equipment for medical consultations with specialists in Tokyo. This seemed suspicious for patients who were supposedly suffering from minor physical ailments. That evening, Kenji decided to investigate personally. He made rounds through the medical wards, paying particular attention to the questionable patients. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears. Several of the supposed patients were clearly healthy military personnel. They carried themselves like active soldiers rather than recovering wounded. They were familiar with weapons and military equipment in ways that medical patients would not be. And they seemed more interested in the ship's navigation and communication systems than in their supposed medical treatment.
"Nurse Tanaka," he said quietly during a private moment, "I believe some of our patients are not actually patients at all. What should we do about it?" "For now, nothing.
but document everything carefully. If this ship is being used for non-medical purposes, we need evidence to protect ourselves and our legitimate patients. Over the following days, Kenji observed more disturbing patterns. The questionable patients maintained military discipline and hierarchy, despite their supposed medical status. They conducted briefings that had nothing to do with medical treatment, and they seemed to be mapping the ship's capabilities and studying its defensive vulnerabilities. Most troubling of all, several of these patients showed particular interest in the American POWs aboard the ship. They asked detailed questions about the prisoners' backgrounds, units, and knowledge of Allied military operations. This looked suspiciously like intelligence gathering disguised as medical interaction. On the fourth day of the voyage, Kenji confronted Captain Sato directly. "Captain, I have serious concerns about some of the personnel aboard the ship. They don't appear to be legitimate medical patients." Sato's expression remained carefully neutral. "All personnel aboard this ship are here in accordance with proper authorization. I'm not at liberty to discuss the specifics of their medical conditions. This isn't about medical confidentiality. It's about the integrity of this ship's medical mission. If we're carrying military personnel disguised as patients, we're violating the Geneva Convention. Doctor, I suggest you focus on your medical duties and leave administrative matters to the appropriate authorities." The conversation ended without resolution, but it confirmed Kenji's suspicions that the hospital ship program was being compromised by military objectives that had nothing to do with medical care. That night, he met secretly with Nurse Tanaka and several other senior medical staff members to discuss their observations. "We're all seeing the same things," reported Chief Pharmacist Watanabe. "Patients who don't need medication, personnel with access to restricted areas, and activities that have nothing to do with medical treatment. The question is what we do about it," Tanaka said. "If we report it officially, we could be charged with insubordination or worse. But if we don't act and this ship becomes a legitimate military target, we could all be killed." Watanabe finished the thought that no one wanted to voice. The medical staff faced an impossible choice. They had sworn oaths to heal the sick and injured, but their ship was apparently being used for purposes that could make it a legitimate target for enemy attack. They could remain silent and hope that Allied forces continued to respect hospital ship neutrality, or they could risk their careers and possibly their lives by reporting the violations to appropriate authorities. For now, we continue our medical duties and document everything we observe. If this situation escalates, we'll need evidence to protect ourselves and our patients. But privately, he was beginning to fear that the situation was already beyond their control. Hospital ships were supposed to be sanctuaries of healing in the midst of warfare, but the Takasago Maru was becoming something far more dangerous, a vessel that traded on medical neutrality while serving military objectives. If Allied intelligence discovered the truth about the ship's dual mission, the consequences would be catastrophic for everyone aboard, legitimate patients and medical staff included. Sergeant William Patterson had been aboard the Takasago Maru for 6 weeks when he began to understand the true complexity of his situation. His leg wound had healed remarkably well under Dr. Yamamoto's care, but his status as a prisoner of war aboard a Japanese hospital ship placed him in a unique and potentially dangerous position. The other American POWs shared his confusion about their circumstances. There were 12 of them in total, Marines and soldiers captured during various Pacific campaigns and brought aboard for medical treatment. They received excellent care, but they were also subjected to subtle interrogation by personnel who claimed to be medical staff but asked questions that had little to do with healthcare. "Something's not right about this setup," Patterson told Corporal Jennings, a Marine captured on Guadalcanal who was recovering from shrapnel wounds. They were speaking quietly in the small section of Ward C that had been designated for American prisoners. "What do you mean?" "Look around. Half the Japanese patients on this ship aren't really patients. They're healthy troops pretending to be wounded. And some of the medical staff ask questions that have nothing to do with our injuries." Jennings had noticed the same things. "That doctor, Yamamoto, he seems legitimate, but there are others who don't act like medical personnel at all." Patterson nodded. "I think this ship is being used for more than medical transport. The question is what we do about it."
The Americans faced an impossible decision. They were prisoners of war aboard what appeared to be a legitimate hospital ship, but they had discovered evidence that the vessel was being used for military purposes that violated international law. If they remained silent, they might be complicit in activities that could harm Allied forces. If they acted on their knowledge, they could face severe punishment or death. Patterson decided to take a calculated risk. During his next medical examination with Dr. Yamamoto, he chose to speak candidly. "Doctor, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me." Yamamoto paused in his examination of Patterson's healing leg wound. "What is it, Sergeant? Is this really just a hospital ship?" The question hung in the air between them. Yamamoto's expression revealed the internal struggle he had been facing for weeks, the same doubts and fears that kept him awake at night. "Why do you ask?" "Because I've been watching, and so have the other Americans. Some of your patients aren't really patients at all, and some of your medical staff have been asking us questions that have nothing to do with our health." Yamamoto set down his medical instruments and sat heavily in the chair beside Patterson's bed. For a long moment, he said nothing, weighing the risks of honesty against the moral burden of continuing a charade that could endanger everyone aboard. "You're right," he said finally. "This ship is being used for purposes beyond medical care. I've tried to maintain medical neutrality, but there are forces beyond my control." "What kind of purposes?" "Intelligence gathering, transport of military personnel, possibly coordination of submarine operations." Yamamoto's voice carried the weight of months of moral compromise. "I became a doctor to save lives, not to enable activities that put lives at risk." Patterson studied the Japanese doctor's face, seeing genuine anguish in his eyes. "What are you going to do about it?" "I don't know. If I report it officially, I could be charged with treason. If I don't act, and Allied forces discover the truth, we could all be killed," Patterson finished. 3 days later, the moral crisis came to a head when intelligence personnel aboard the ship began pressuring the American POWs for detailed information about Allied positions and operations in the Solomon Islands. The interrogations were conducted under the guise of medical evaluations, but their true purpose was unmistakable. Corporal Jenkins was the first to be subjected to intensive questioning by a man who claimed to be a medical psychologist, but was clearly an intelligence officer. "Tell me about your unit's positions on Guadalcanal. Understanding your combat stress requires knowledge of the tactical situations you experienced." Jenkins refused to provide military information, citing the Geneva Convention's protections for prisoners of war. The interrogator became increasingly aggressive, threatening to withhold medical treatment if Jenkins didn't cooperate. When Patterson heard about the incident, he knew the situation had become untenable. That evening, he requested a private meeting with Dr. Yamamoto. "Doctor, your intelligence people are violating the Geneva Convention by interrogating wounded prisoners under the guise of medical treatment. This has to stop." Yamamoto's face showed the strain of weeks of moral conflict. "I have no authority over intelligence operations. My protests have been ignored." "Then we need to find another solution." Patterson outlined a desperate plan that would require cooperation between the American prisoners and sympathetic Japanese medical staff. If they could document the violations taking place aboard the ship and find a way to communicate this information to Allied forces, they might be able to expose the abuse of hospital ship neutrality while protecting the legitimate patients and medical personnel. It's incredibly dangerous, Yamamoto warned. If we're discovered, we could all be executed for treason. If we don't act, and Allied submarines attack this ship thinking it's a legitimate military target, we'll all be killed anyway. Yamamoto made the most difficult decision of his life. What do you need me to do?
Over the following week, a secret alliance formed between the American POWs and several Japanese medical staff members who were horrified by the militarization of their hospital ship. Led by Dr. Yamamoto and Nurse Tanaka, they began documenting evidence of the ship's dual mission while maintaining the appearance of normal medical operations. The Americans used their position as patients to observe and record intelligence activities. The Japanese medical staff photographed personnel and equipment that had no legitimate medical purpose. Together, they compiled a dossier that clearly demonstrated the ship's violations of Geneva Convention protocols. The plan was to transmit this information to Allied forces through a coded medical radio message that would appear to be a routine request for medical supplies. If successful, it would alert Allied commanders to the true nature of the ship while providing evidence that could protect legitimate medical personnel from war crimes charges. But the plan required access to the ship's radio equipment, which was heavily guarded and monitored by intelligence personnel. Nurse Tanaka volunteered for the most dangerous part of the mission. As senior medical staff, she had legitimate reasons to access communication equipment for medical consultations. During a scheduled radio check with Tokyo, she planned to transmit additional coded information that would alert Allied intelligence to the ship's dual mission. The opportunity came on March 10, 1944, when the ship was en route to evacuate wounded from the Mariana Islands. During a routine medical consultation with a Tokyo hospital, Tanaka managed to include coded references that identified the ship's location, described its dual mission, and warned of impending intelligence operations. The transmission was successful, but Tanaka's suspicious behavior was noticed by intelligence personnel monitoring the radio room. Within hours, she was arrested on charges of espionage and treason. Dr. Yamamoto learned of Tanaka's arrest from Captain Sato, who summoned him to his quarters with grim news. Nurse Tanaka has been charged with transmitting classified information to enemy forces, Sato announced. Intelligence officers believe she was working with the American prisoners to compromise ship security. Yamamoto felt his world collapse. What evidence do they have? Radio logs showing unauthorized transmissions during her medical consultation. Her activities have been under surveillance for weeks. What will happen to her? Sato's expression was somber. Court-martial, followed by execution for treason. Intelligence is also investigating possible accomplices among the medical staff and prisoners. Yamamoto realized that the conspiracy was unraveling rapidly. Within days, intelligence officers would discover the evidence they had compiled and the network of cooperation between American prisoners and Japanese medical staff. Everyone involved would face charges of treason and espionage. That evening, he made a final, desperate decision. If Tanaka's transmission had been successful, Allied forces would soon be aware of the ship's true mission. Rather than wait for the inevitable investigation and executions, he would try to save as many innocent lives as possible. He met secretly with Patterson and the other American prisoners to warn them of the impending crisis. "They know about our activities," he told them. "Nurse Tanaka has been arrested, and they're investigating everyone who might have been involved." "What about you?" Patterson asked. "I'm a senior medical officer. It will take them longer to build a case against me, but you're prisoners of war. They can execute you immediately for espionage." Yamamoto proposed a final, desperate gambit. He would use his medical authority to declare the American prisoners unfit for transport due to medical complications, requiring their immediate evacuation to a neutral vessel for treatment. It was a long shot,
but it might save their lives if Tanaka's transmission had reached Allied forces. But before he could act on this plan, the USS Barracuda's torpedoes found their target. The first torpedo struck at 11:47 p.m. on March 15, 1944, exactly as our story began. The explosion tore through the ship's hull just below the Red Cross marking, and the carefully maintained facade of medical neutrality collapsed along with the bulkheads.
Dr. Yamamoto moved through the chaos with professional efficiency, organizing evacuation procedures and trying to save as many lives as possible. But he knew that the ship's dual mission had finally caught up with them. Allied intelligence had received Tanaka's warning and acted on it. In the confusion of the sinking, he found Patterson trapped beneath debris in Ward C. Working together, they managed to free the American sergeant and help him reach a lifeboat. "Doctor," Patterson gasped as they struggled through the tilting corridors, "I want you to know what you did was right. You tried to save innocent lives." "It wasn't enough," Yamamoto replied, helping Patterson into a life jacket. "Too many people will die because of decisions made by others." As they reached the boat deck, they could see the USS Barracuda's silhouette in the moonlight. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell stood on the submarine's bridge, watching the hospital ship slide beneath the waves and wrestle with the knowledge that he had just sunk a vessel carrying wounded soldiers and medical personnel. The cold waters of the South China Sea claimed 237 lives that night. Japanese wounded, American prisoners, medical staff, intelligence personnel, and crew members alike. The sea made no distinction between innocent and guilty, between those who had tried to maintain medical neutrality and those who had compromised it. Dr. Kenji Yamamoto survived the sinking and spent the rest of the war in an Allied prisoner camp, where he continued to practice medicine and treat wounded soldiers from both sides. After Japan's surrender, he testified at war crimes tribunals about the abuse of hospital ship neutrality, helping to establish legal precedents that would protect medical personnel in future conflicts. Sergeant William Patterson also survived and returned to the United States, where he spent years advocating for the protection of medical neutrality in warfare. He remained in contact with Dr. Yamamoto for the rest of his life, their friendship transcending the boundaries of nationality and former enmity. Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell never fully recovered from the moral burden of sinking the Takasago Maru. After the war, he left the Navy and became an advocate for international humanitarian law, working to strengthen protections for medical personnel and wounded soldiers. Nurse Akiko Tanaka was executed for treason 3 days before the ship was sunk, but her brave transmission had alerted Allied forces to the hospital ship's dual mission, potentially saving other lives by exposing the violations of medical neutrality. The sinking of the Takasago Maru became a symbol of the moral complexities of warfare, where the abuse of humanitarian principles by one side can lead to tragic consequences for innocent people on all sides. It demonstrated that, in war, the corruption of mercy and healing can be just as devastating as the violence itself. The story of the Takasago Maru reminds us that warfare's greatest tragedies often occur not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet moments when moral principles are compromised for military advantage. The hospital ship that was meant to be a beacon of healing and neutrality became instead a symbol of how war can corrupt even the most sacred humanitarian traditions. Dr. Yamamoto's struggle to maintain medical ethics in an impossible situation reflects the challenges faced by medical personnel throughout history who have tried to remain true to their calling while serving in conflicts that demand moral compromise. His friendship with Sergeant Patterson demonstrates that human decency can survive even the most brutal circumstances, and that the bonds forged through shared suffering can transcend national boundaries and former enmity. The tragedy of the Takasago Maru was not just the loss of life when the ship sank, but the earlier loss of innocence when the vessel's medical mission was compromised by military objectives.
In violating the neutrality of hospital ships, the Japanese military not only betrayed international law, but also endangered the very people they claimed to protect. Yet the story also shows the power of individual conscience and moral courage. Dr. Yamamoto, Nurse Tanaka, and the American prisoners who worked together to expose the truth demonstrated that even in the darkest circumstances, people can choose to do what is right regardless of the personal cost. Their legacy lives on in the modern legal frameworks that protect medical personnel and wounded soldiers in contemporary conflicts. The Geneva Conventions were strengthened after World War II, partly in response to incidents like the sinking of the Takasago Maru, ensuring that future generations of medical personnel would have stronger legal protections for their humanitarian mission. In the end, the story of the Mercy Fleet reminds us that in warfare, the protection of mercy itself may be the most important battle of all, and that victory in that battle is measured not in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in the preservation of humanity itself.
Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through one of World War II's most morally complex maritime tragedies. The story of the Takasago Maru and her crew represents just one of countless untold stories from history's greatest conflict. Stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary moral challenges, of friendship forged across enemy lines, and of the courage required to do what's right when everything else is wrong. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about the complexities of warfare and human nature, I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd take a moment to hit that like button and share this video with someone who would appreciate this kind of deep, thoughtful storytelling. Your support makes it possible for me to spend the weeks of research and writing required to bring you these epic, novel-length historical narratives. This channel is dedicated to exploring the untold stories of history, the human dramas, moral dilemmas, and incredible acts of courage that shaped our world. From forgotten battles to unlikely friendships, from moral heroes to complex villains, we dive deep into the stories that reveal the full complexity of the human experience. If you're hungry for more stories like this one, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest releases. We have incredible stories coming up about everything from Arctic survival adventures to Cold War espionage, from ancient mysteries to modern moral dilemmas. Drop a comment below and let me know what you thought of Dr. Yamamoto's impossible choices, or share your thoughts on how medical neutrality should be protected in modern conflicts. I read every comment and love hearing your perspectives on these complex historical situations. Until next time, remember that behind every historical event are real people making difficult choices, and that understanding their stories helps us better understand ourselves. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next incredible journey through history.